Every morning, before Bimbala left the house, she would iron her sunflower dress. Even on the days she had no money for kerosene, even on the days Tenny didn't eat, she would still find a way to make sure that dress had no wrinkles. A woman that poor shouldn't care that much about how she looks to a stranger on the street. Unless the stranger wasn't really a stranger. She had ironed it at 4:47 in the morning by the light of her phone screen because Nipa had taken the light again. The dress, dark navy with small gold flowers that had once been bright, lay flat across the plastic chair in the corner of the room while Tenny slept. Bimbala pressed the iron slowly, the way you press something you are afraid of ruining. When she was done, she held it up and looked at it for a long time. Then she put it on. By 6 o'clock she was on a Papa road with her cooler, her small folding table and Tenny, who was still half asleep and dragging her blue slippers against the pavement. The morning air smelled like diesel and wet concrete. Bimbala set up her stall the way she always did. Cooler on the left, stack of plastic bowls on the right, her purse tucked under the table where she could feel it against her ankle. She had 3,200 Nigerian nairas left. She knew the exact number because she had counted it 3 times before leaving the house. She did not need to be told that the money would not be enough. She already knew. What she needed was for the next 48 hours to go quietly. The man was already there when she arrived. That was the first thing that unsettled her. He was sitting on the low concrete curb across the road in a plain gray cap and a white shirt that had been washed so many times it was nearly the color of old paper. His trousers were clean but cheap. His shoes, brown leather, slightly worn at the heel, were the only thing about him that looked like they had once cost real money. He wasn't doing anything. He was just sitting, watching the road the way old men watch things they have already decided they cannot change. Bimbala noticed him and looked away. She had trained herself, over the past 3 months, to look away from things that made her nervous. She served 4 customers before he crossed the road. She saw him coming from the corner of her eye, the slow, unhurried walk of a man who had nowhere urgent to be, and she kept her face neutral. By the time he reached her table, she had already decided he was just hungry. "How much for the jollof?" he asked. 300, she said. "With chicken." He nodded, sat down on the small bench beside her stall and waited. Bimbala served him without looking at his face. She spooned the rice, added the chicken. She always gave slightly more chicken than she should, it was a habit she couldn't explain, and placed the bowl in front of him. Tenny was sitting on the cooler behind her, drawing something on the back of a receipt with a blue pen. The street was filling up now, Okadas threading between the slow-moving traffic, a woman selling pure water calling out from 3 stalls down. Ordinary Tuesday sounds. The kind of sounds that make a secret feel temporarily safe. She was counting change for another customer when she saw it. The man had not touched his food. He was holding the bowl, but he was looking at a copy of the punch that someone had left on the bench beside him, and his eyes had gone still in the way eyes go still when a person is thinking about something they haven't said out loud yet. The newspaper was 2 days old. Bimbala knew that edition. She had that edition. The front page had a photograph of a man in court robes, gavel in hand, and the headline read, "Justice Adewale delivers record sentence in fraud case. Defense calls it merciless." She had read that headline so many times the ink had softened at the fold. The man on her bench, the man holding her bowl of jollof rice, was the man in that photograph. She did not drop anything. She did not make a sound. What she did was turn back to her cooler and open it, even though she did not need anything from inside it, and she stood there with her hand resting on the cold metal edge, breathing the way you breathe when you are trying to convince your own body that everything is fine. His name was Collins Adewale. Justice Collins Adewale. The newspapers called him the maximum sentence judge, not as a compliment. 3 years ago, a man had stood before him convicted of stealing 2 million Nigerian nairas in a procurement scam. Collins had given him 7 years. No option of fine. The defense had appealed. The appeal failed. The journalists wrote about him the way people write about weather, as something that does not negotiate. Her husband's case was on his docket. The final hearing was in 48 hours. Tenny tugged at the back of Bimbala's dress. "Mummy, the man isn't eating." Bimbala turned around. Collins was watching her daughter with an expression she could not immediately read, not pity, not curiosity, something quieter than both. When he saw Bimbala looking, he picked up his fork. "It smells very good," he said, and his voice was exactly what she had not expected. Gentle. A little tired. The voice of a man who had been somewhere loud for a long time and was grateful for the quiet. She said, "Thank you," and the words came out steady, which surprised her. He ate slowly. He didn't speak again until he was nearly done, and when he did, it was just to ask if she cooked here every day. She told him yes, Monday to Saturday. He nodded, folded the newspaper under his arm without looking at it again, and placed 500 Nigerian nairas on the table. "Keep the change," he said. Bimbala watched him walk back across the road, unhurried, the gray cap tilted slightly to the left. She watched until he turned the corner and disappeared. Then she looked down at the 500 Nigerian nairas note on her table, and something happened in her chest that she didn't have a name for, something between relief and the specific kind of fear that comes not from what has happened, but from what you have just decided to let happen. She picked up the money. She tucked it into her purse. And then she began to plan how she would make sure he came back tomorrow. He came back the next morning at the same time. Bimbala saw him from down the road while she was still setting up, and she made herself continue what she was doing, unfolding the table, setting the bowls in a straight line, adjusting the small handwritten price sign that didn't need adjusting. She had spent part of the previous night telling herself that he wouldn't return, that he was just a hungry old man who had found a cheap meal on a long walk, that the fact that he worked in the same system that was currently deciding her husband's fate was nothing more than the kind of cruel coincidence Lagos specialized in. She had almost believed it by 2 a.m. By 3 a.m. she had stopped trying. Collins crossed the road with the same unhurried walk, the same gray cap, this time with a slightly newer-looking shirt, pale blue, collared, tucked in neatly. He sat on the bench before she acknowledged him and placed his phone face down on the table the way people place things they don't want to be distracted by. It was an older Samsung, the kind with a cracked corner on the screen, which she noticed because she had expected something different. A man of his position, she had imagined, would carry something sleeker. An iPhone, maybe. A Samsung Galaxy at the very least with an uncracked screen. The cracked corner made him feel, briefly, like someone she could afford to misread. "Jollof again?" she asked. "Do you make anything else?" "Fried rice. Beans and plantain on Thursdays." "Then jollof," he said. Tenny was in her usual spot on the cooler, her school bag between her feet even though it was a Wednesday and there was no school. The school fees had not been paid since October, and Bimbala had told the headmistress she was waiting on a transfer from her husband's family. Another small lie folded inside a larger one, the way you pack a wound. Tenny was playing a game on Bimbala's old technophone, the sound turned off, her small feet swinging against the side of the cooler in a steady rhythm. Collins glanced at her once, then back at his food. They didn't speak for a while. The street was doing its usual morning things, a Danfo bus conductor leaning out the door shouting a destination nobody seemed to want, the smell of agbalumo from the fruit cellar 2 stalls down, a group of school children in yellow uniforms walking in a loose, noisy cluster. Bimbala served 2 other customers, made change, wiped down the table. Collins ate slowly, like a man who had learned somewhere along the way that eating fast was a habit of people who didn't trust their environment. It was Tenny who broke the quiet, the way children break things, without warning and without understanding what they've broken. She had looked up from the phone and was watching Collins with the direct, uncomplicated stare that small children aim at strangers, the kind of stare that adults spend years learning to soften. Collins looked back at her without flinching, which most adults did when Tenny stared. He simply looked back, fork resting in his bowl. "My papa has a loud room," Tenny said. It came out the way observations come out of 6-year-olds, not as a statement designed for anyone in particular, just a fact she had been carrying and had now decided to set down. Bimbala's hand went to Tenny's shoulder before she had finished the sentence. "Ah, this one." She laughed, a short, bright sound that had nothing real behind it. "She's been watching too many cartoons. The characters are always in these big, loud places." She squeezed Tenny's shoulder gently but with enough pressure that Tenny glanced up at her, confused. "Go and finish your game, my dear." Tenny looked at the phone, then at Collins, then back at her mother. Children understand pressure before they understand the reason for it. She took the phone and went back to her game. Collins had not looked away from Bimbala. He wasn't staring, it was more precise than that. He was the way he probably was in a courtroom when a witness said something that didn't line up, still and waiting. "How old is she?" he asked. 6, Bimbala said. "She'll be 7 in March. She talks like she's older. She spends too much time with adults." Bimbala turned back to the cooler and busied herself rearranging things that were already arranged. Her father travels for work. Long trips. So it's mostly just the two of us. The lie came out smoothly, the way lies do when you have practiced them enough times that your voice no longer knows the difference. She had said the same thing to her landlord, to the women at the market, to Tenny's headmistress. Her husband traveled. Long trips. The kind of work that takes a man away for months. She had built the story carefully, one conversation at a time, and she had told it so many times that there were moments, brief, dangerous moments, when she almost forgot what the real version was. Collins said, "Long trips." He didn't say it like a question. He said it the way you repeat something back to someone when you want them to hear how it sounds from the outside. Bimbala looked at him. He was looking at his bowl, turning a piece of chicken slowly with his fork. His expression was neutral, but there was something careful in the neutrality, the way a room is careful when someone has just left it. She said, "He works in Port Harcourt. Oil sector." Collins nodded. "That's hard. On the family, I mean. The distance." "You manage," she said. "Yes," he said. "People manage a lot of things." He finished eating, left 500 Nigerian nairas again, and walked away. Bimbala watched him go. Tenny had abandoned the phone and was now reorganizing the stack of plastic bowls into a tower that would eventually fall. Bimbala let her. She was thinking about the way Collins had repeated the words, long trips, and what a man who had spent decades listening to people explain themselves in courtrooms would hear in a pause that was half a second too long. Here is what nobody tells you about lying to protect someone you love. The lie doesn't stay the size you made it. You tell one small lie to cover a wound, and the wound shifts, and the lie has to stretch to cover the new shape of it, and then it shifts again, and you stretch again, and one day you look down and the lie is so large it is covering parts of your life that didn't even need covering. Bimbala had started with one sentence, "He travels for work," and it had grown, the way debt grows when you only ever pay the interest. The truth was that her husband, Femi, was in Kirikiri. Medium security. He had been there for 4 months waiting for the final hearing of a case that had taken 11 months to get this far. The crime, and she did not let herself use any softer word for it, because soft words were also a kind of lie, was fraud. He had falsified procurement documents at the construction company where he worked, redirected 4.7 million Nigerian nairas over 8 months, and used every naira of it to pay for Tenny's open-heart surgery at the Reddington Hospital in Victoria Island. The surgery had cost more than their combined savings, more than his salary for 2 years, more than anything they had ever imagined spending at once. He had done it without telling her. By the time she found out, the invoices were already in a prosecutor's file. She had not known whether to be grateful or destroyed. She had settled, eventually, for both. The case had passed through 2 judges before landing, 3 months ago, on Collins Adewale's docket. She had read his name in the court documents Femi's lawyer had sent her on WhatsApp, and that same evening she had searched his name on Google and read everything she could find. The articles were consistent, thorough, unsentimental, unmoved by circumstance. One defense lawyer had been quoted saying that presenting a sympathetic case to Collins Adewale was like presenting flowers to a wall. The journalist had written it as a compliment. That was when Bimbala had started ironing the sunflower dress every morning. She was not stupid enough to think that a bowl of jollof rice would change a verdict. She knew it didn't work like that. But she had nothing else, and when you have nothing else, you do not look for logic, you look for a crack in the wall. You look for the version of the man that the newspapers don't print. The tired one. The one who sits on a curb and eats rice from a plastic bowl and places his cracked Samsung face down because he doesn't want to be interrupted. She was not trying to bribe him. She was trying to find out if he was human. That evening, after she had packed up the stall and walked Tenny home, Tenny's hand in hers, the child chattering about something she had seen on the technophone, Bimbala sat on the edge of her bed and pulled the newspaper clipping from underneath the mattress. The photograph of Collins was slightly creased from being folded and unfolded too many times. She looked at his face in the photograph, then thought about the face that had sat across from her that morning, turning a piece of chicken slowly with a fork. They were the same man. She kept forgetting that. She folded the clipping again and put it back. Then she lay down beside Tenny, who was already asleep, and stared at the ceiling and thought about the word manage and the quiet, particular way Collins had used it, as if he knew that it was the word people used when the real word was too heavy to carry in public. 36 hours until the final hearing. She had not yet decided what she would do when it was over. She had only decided what she would do before it: show up, serve the rice, keep the dress ironed, and hope that somewhere between the version of Collins Adewale in the newspaper and the version that ate her food in silence, there was enough space for Mercy to breathe. What she had not planned for was that Collins was doing his own calculating. And he was much better at it than she was. She had told the lie so many times it had stopped feeling like one. And the man sitting across from her had spent 30 years making sure lies like that didn't go unnoticed. If you've ever protected someone you love by carrying something alone, you already know how this ends. But you don't know what it costs her to get there. The next chapter is where the story stops being about secrets and starts being about survival. Don't leave now. Keep watching. She had not meant to bring it with her. That was the thing she would come back to, later, in the specific way you return to the exact moment before something went wrong, not to fix it because you can't fix it, but because the mind needs to understand how a careful person can be undone by something as small as a brown envelope tucked inside a market bag. The brief had been given to her by Femi's lawyer, a thin, fast-talking man named Babatunde who worked out of a two-room office in Surulere with a ceiling fan that worked on only one speed and a receptionist who doubled as his wife. Babatunde had called her the previous afternoon and asked her to come in, which she did, taking 2 buses and arriving with Tenny asleep against her shoulder. He had given her a brown A4 envelope, the cheap kind, the flap sealed with tape instead of glue, and told her it was a copy of the prosecution's closing argument, filed that morning. He wanted her to read it before the hearing. He said it was important she understood what they were walking into. She had put the envelope in her market bag, under the fold of a wrapper she carried for Tenny, and then she had forgotten it was there. Or not forgotten, she had been aware of it the way you are aware of a stone in your shoe that you have decided to deal with later. She had other things to manage. The stall. The 3,200 Nigerian nairas that had to become more. The dress. Thursday was beans and plantain day. She had woken up at 5 a.m. to boil the beans, which always took longer than you planned, and by the time she got the pot off the fire and packed everything and dressed Tenny and found the child's left sandal behind the door where it had no business being, she was 20 minutes behind. She left the house in a different kind of hurry than usual, not the contained, deliberate hurry of a woman managing a secret, but the ordinary, slightly breathless hurry of a mother running late. The market bag went over her shoulder. The envelope went with it. She got to the stall, set up, served the first 3 customers, and then Tenny complained that her stomach hurt, which it sometimes did in the mornings before she had eaten properly. Bimbala left the stall, left it, walked Tenny to the chemist 2 streets away, bought a sachet of Alabucan and a Ribena carton and stood outside the chemist watching the child drink it slowly in the yellow plastic chair the chemist kept by the door for exactly these situations. Tenny's color came back within 15 minutes. Bimbala walked her back, settled her on the cooler, and it was only when she reached into the market bag for her cloth to wipe the table that she did not feel the envelope. She looked in the bag again. She moved the wrapper, the spare bowl, the small bottle of vegetable oil, the Tenny spare sandal she carried everywhere since the incident with the left one. No envelope. She stood very still. The beans were still warm in the cooler. Then she turned and saw Collins. He was standing at the far end of her table, which meant he had arrived while she was gone, which meant he had been at her stall alone. He was holding the brown envelope with both hands, not open, the tape was still on the flap, but held in a way that told her he had read the name on the front. Because Babatunde, being the kind of lawyer who believed in being thorough about small things if nothing else, had written the case number on the outside of the envelope in blue pen. Neat, clear numbers. The kind a man who had presided over that same case file for 3 months would recognize without having to look twice. Collins looked up when she reached the table. His expression was the same one he always wore, measured, giving nothing away for free, but his eyes moved from her face to the envelope and back, and in that small movement was the entire problem. "You dropped this," he said. "I saw it on the ground when I came. I didn't want someone to walk away with it." "Thank you," Bimbala said. She took the envelope from him with one hand and put it directly into the bag, under the wrapper, without looking at it. Her other hand was already reaching for the serving spoon. "Beans and plantain today. You want to try something different?" She did not wait for him to answer. She was already spooning the beans into a bowl because movement was safer than stillness and conversation was safer than silence, and the only way out of the next 60 seconds was through them. Collins sat down. He watched her serve him. He did not immediately ask about the envelope, which was almost worse than if he had. "You work in law?" he said, eventually. She kept her eyes on the bowl. "Sorry." "The envelope. It had a case number on it." He said it gently, the way you say something you already know the answer to, just to see what the other person does with the question. Bimbala set the bowl in front of him. She had run through 12 different responses in the 4 seconds it took to place it on the table, and what she settled on was not the best option but the only one that felt survivable. "I run documents for a law firm," she said. "One of the lawyers, he sends me to deliver things, pick things up. I'm just a runner. It's extra income." She gestured at the stall with her free hand, the way you gesture at something you want someone to look at instead of you. "This isn't always enough." Collins looked at the stall, then back at her. He picked up his fork. "Which firm?" "Adeniji and Associates. In Suralire." She said it without hesitating because the name was real, it was adjacent to Babatunde's building, and a real name is always more convincing than a made-up one. This was something she had learned not from a book but from 3 months of living inside a story she hadn't written. Here is what nobody tells you about the lies you tell to protect someone. You don't decide to become a liar. You make one small choice to avoid a painful truth, and that choice works, and because it works, you make another, and before long you have built an entire parallel version of your life. Same address, same face, different architecture. The danger isn't the lies themselves. The danger is how quickly they start to feel like the truth. How, after a while, you stop feeling the gap between what you're saying and what is real, the way you stop feeling a scar after it has healed over. Collins nodded slowly, the way he nodded when he was processing something, which she had started to recognize. He ate. She served other customers. Tenny had fallen asleep on the cooler, her head resting on the technophone in a way that would leave a rectangular mark on her cheek. "Long walk from Suralire to here," Collins said, halfway through his bowl. "I don't always come this way," Bimbala said. "It depends on where the delivery is." "And today's delivery, is it nearby?" "Already done," she said. "I dropped things off early." He looked at her for a moment. Not the courtroom look, not the one she had been afraid of from the beginning. Something quieter. The look of a person who is deciding whether to say the thing they are actually thinking. He looked back down at his food instead. Bimbala wiped the already clean table. She would think about this exchange for the rest of the day, turning it over the way you turn a stone in your hand, feeling for the edge, trying to understand its weight. She had managed it. The cover-up had held. She had given him a name, a location, a logic, and he had nodded and returned to his beans. That was what she told herself on the bus home, Tenny asleep against her arm, the brown envelope now tucked deep in the bag where she should have put it from the beginning. What she did not account for was the thing she had done with her eyes when she took the envelope back. She had not looked at it. A person who was simply embarrassed to have dropped a work document would glance at it, check if it had been opened, make sure it was intact. A person with nothing to hide would do the natural thing. Bimbala had taken it and buried it in the bag without a single downward glance, the way you hide something you are afraid someone will see your reaction to. Collins had noticed. He noticed it the way he noticed everything, quietly, without showing that he had noticed, filing it away in the careful, organized part of his mind that had spent 30 years sorting testimony into what was said and what was meant. He didn't finish his plantain. He left 500 Nigerian nairas on the table as usual and walked away. But this time, at the corner of the road, he stopped. He took out his cracked Samsung and dialed a number. The person on the other end picked up after 2 rings. "Pull up the Adewale versus State file for me," Collins said. "The defendant's full personal details. Wife's name, address." The pause. "Yes, today. Before close of business." He put the phone in his pocket and kept walking, and the street swallowed him the way streets swallow people who know exactly where they are going. The courtroom smelled like old paper and the particular kind of air conditioning that doesn't actually cool anything. It just moves the hot air around until everyone has agreed, silently, to stop expecting relief. The fluorescent lights overhead were the yellow-white of cheap office buildings, the kind that make everyone look slightly unwell, slightly guilty of something. There were ceiling tiles missing in the back left corner. Someone had placed a plastic bucket beneath the gap, and it had clearly not rained recently because the bucket was dry and dusty, but it was still there, which meant the problem had been acknowledged and then left alone. Bimbala noticed all of this in the first 2 minutes because noticing small things was easier than looking at the bench. She had arrived 40 minutes early. She was sitting in the last row, which in this courtroom was only 5 rows from the front because the room was not large. The wooden benches were the color of things that had been varnished once a long time ago. She had chosen the end seat, closest to the aisle, not because she planned to leave quickly but because sitting against a wall made her feel contained in a way that helped. She was wearing the sunflower dress. She had ironed it that morning, same as always, but the Lagos humidity had undone most of the ironing by the time she got off the bus, and the dress now had the soft, slightly deflated look of something that had tried very hard and lost anyway. Tenny was not with her. She had left the child with her neighbor, Mrs. Folake, a retired schoolteacher who kept a tin of cabin biscuits on her center table and let Tenny eat them without asking. Bimbala had told Mrs. Folake she had a hospital appointment. Another addition to the architecture. Babatunde sat at the defense table, his slim leather folder open in front of him, a biro tucked behind his ear. He had called her the previous evening and told her to come, to sit quietly in the back, to not speak to anyone. He had said it like a warning. She had said yes the way you say yes to things you are going to do regardless. The prosecution lawyer was a woman named Adiz, tall, with close-cropped hair and the kind of posture that made it clear she had never once walked into a room apologetically. She wore a black suit over a white blouse and carried her files in a structured leather tote that was not quite Gucci but close enough to signal that she took herself seriously. She spoke to her assistant in a low voice while they waited, and she did not look at Babatunde, which Bimbala understood to mean they had spoken enough times to no longer need to perform acknowledgement. Femi was brought in through the side door. Bimbala had not seen him in 41 days. She had counted. Prison visits had been complicated by the paperwork Babatunde kept needing her to sign, by Tenny's ear infection in January, by the cost of the bus fare, by the version of pride that makes a woman unwilling to let her husband see her when she has nothing better to report than survival. He looked thinner. Not dramatically thinner, not the thinness of illness, but the gradual thinness of a man whose body has been running on correctional facility food and the specific kind of worry that doesn't let you sleep past 4 a.m. He was wearing a plain dark shirt she didn't recognize, which meant someone had brought it for him, and she filed that away to ask about later, and then she remembered that after today there might not be a later for casual questions. He sat down beside Babatunde and did not scan the room the way people in films scan rooms in courtrooms. He kept his eyes forward, which told her the lawyers had briefed him on how to appear. She was grateful for that. She was also grateful that he hadn't seen her yet, because she needed a moment to look at him the way you look at something you are afraid of losing, thoroughly, while you still can. The door at the back of the bench opened at exactly 9:17 a.m. Collins walked in. He was wearing his robes. Full court dress. The black gown, the white bands at the collar, the kind of formal weight that transforms a person into an institution. He looked exactly like the photograph in the newspaper, except that the photograph had not captured the way he moved, which was with a particular economy of effort. No wasted motion, no performance of authority, because a man who has had authority long enough stops needing to perform it. He took his seat at the bench and set his files in front of him and put on his glasses and looked down at the papers, and Bimbala watched his face and searched it for the man who had sat on a curb outside her stall eating jollof rice with a cracked Samsung placed face down beside him, and she could not find him. He was completely, professionally absent. The hearing began. She understood perhaps 60% of what was said in the first 30 minutes. Babatunde made a submission about mitigating circumstances. She heard the words medical emergency, minor child, no prior record, remorse, and he said them carefully, the way you arrange furniture in a small room to make it look larger than it is. Adiz listened with her pen resting against her bottom lip, not writing anything down, which Bimbala had already decided was a bad sign. Then Adiz stood up. She spoke for 20 minutes without notes, which is a specific kind of confidence that only comes from knowing your argument well enough to trust it without a script. She covered the case methodically, the timeline, the falsified documents, the amount, the duration, the deliberate nature of each transaction. She said the word deliberate 4 times. Then she paused, and the pause was long enough that the room shifted its weight, and she said, "Your Honor, the court should also be aware of a matter that came to the prosecution's attention this week." Bimbala's hands, resting on her knees, went still. "It has come to light," Adiz continued, her voice carrying the particular flatness of someone delivering information they know is explosive, "that the defendant's wife has made repeated contact with Your Honor in the period leading up to this hearing. Specifically, on at least 4 occasions, she positioned herself in proximity to Your Honor on Apapa Road, providing meals and engaging in personal conversation, in what the prosecution submits was a calculated attempt to create a relationship of goodwill that might influence the outcome of these proceedings. The room did the thing rooms do when something unexpected lands in them. A small collective adjustment, a few heads turning, the scratch of a pen. Babatunde was on his feet. "Objection, Your Honor, this is—" "I will hear the submission," Collins said. His voice was exactly the same as it had been at her stall. That was somehow the worst thing about it. Adiz continued. She said the word stalking once, bracketed by softer words to blunt its edge but not so soft that it disappeared. She said illicit influence. She said pattern of behavior. She placed each phrase down on the table of the courtroom's attention like evidence, which is exactly what they were. Femi turned his head slowly and looked at the back of the room. His eyes found her immediately, which meant he had known she was there from the moment she sat down, which meant he had been choosing not to look, and now he could not choose that anymore. His expression did not collapse. He looked at her the way a person looks at someone who has done something painful out of love, not with anger, but with a kind of grief that is worse than anger because it has no direction. She looked back at him and did not look away. Collins took off his glasses. He set them on the bench with the same precision he used for everything. The room waited. "Counsel," he said to Adiz, "the submission is noted. The court will not, however, treat unverified social contact as grounds for a formal allegation of interference without substantive evidence of intent." He paused. "That said, the court takes the matter seriously and will note it in the record." Adiz sat down with the expression of someone who had expected exactly this response and had made the submission for the record anyway, which meant she hadn't needed it to win. She already had enough to win. The 4.7 million Nigerian nairas was documented. The falsified invoices were documented. The 8 months of deliberate transactions were documented. All of that was still on the table, untouched by the bowl of jollof rice or the sunflower dress or any of it. Babatunde made his final submission. He spoke about Tenny's surgery, about the Reddington hospital bills that were in evidence, about a father who had committed a crime for a reason that did not make the crime disappear but that the court should weigh when considering the appropriate response. He was good. Bimbala had not fully understood until now how good he was. The way he spoke about Femi not as a man who had done something wrong but as a man who had been in a place where all the options were wrong, and had picked the one that kept his daughter alive. She had never thought about it that way. She had been so deep inside the situation that she had never once stepped outside it and looked at it plainly. Her husband had stolen money to save their child. That was the whole story. Everything else, the lies, the dress, the rice, the courtroom, was just what happened to the people standing in the aftermath of that one fact. There is a thing they don't teach you anywhere, not in school, not in church, not in the conversations mothers have with daughters before they marry, that love is not the same as protection. You can love someone completely and still not be able to protect them. You can do everything, every possible thing, and the outcome can still be decided by forces that were never in your hands. Bimbala had spent 4 months believing that if she was careful enough, creative enough, present enough, she could bend the situation toward survival. She had not considered that the situation might simply be what it was. Collins put his glasses back on. He looked at his papers for a long time. Then he looked up at the room with the expression of a man who has made a decision and has made peace with having made it, and said, "The court will adjourn for 1 hour before delivering its ruling." He stood. Everyone stood. He walked back through the door he had come from, and it closed behind him with a sound like something being sealed. Femi was still looking at her. Babatunde was leaning toward him, saying something low and urgent, but Femi's eyes were still on Bimbala, and she understood what he was asking her without words, the same thing he had always asked her without words, from the day they found out about Tenny's heart, from the day the doctor at the Lagos University Teaching Hospital had said the words open heart surgery in the tone people use when they are preparing you for a number. He was asking her if she was okay. She nodded once. He looked at her for another second. Then he turned back to Babatunde. Bimbala stayed in her seat while the courtroom emptied around her. She did not go outside to get air. She did not call anyone. She sat with her hands flat on her knees and the sunflower dress soft and wrinkled around her, and she waited, the way she had been waiting for 4 months, for someone else's decision about her life to come back through a door. The bucket under the ceiling tile was still empty. The problem was still there. Someone had acknowledged it, and then left it alone. An hour had never felt so much like a verdict before it was won. Collins came back through the door at 11:04 a.m. Bimbala knew the exact time because she had been staring at the clock on the wall above the bench, a plain, institutional clock with a white face and black numerals, the second hand moving in that particular way cheap clocks move, not smoothly but in small, distinct jerks, each one its own separate decision. She had counted approximately 216 of those jerks in the last few minutes before the door opened. She had not been aware she was counting until she stopped. The room resettled. Everyone stood, then sat. Babatunde straightened his folder. Femi kept his hands flat on the table in front of him, fingers spread slightly, the posture of a man who has decided to receive whatever is coming without flinching. Adiz uncapped her pen and held it over a fresh page, ready to record the number, because in cases like this, it always came down to a number. Collins sat. He put on his glasses. He looked at his papers for a moment, then looked up at the room with the expression of a man who understood that what he was about to say would be the only thing several people in this room would remember about this day for the rest of their lives. He convicted Femi. He said it in the language of courts, measured, referenced, footnoted with precedent, but the meaning was plain. Guilty on all counts. The falsification of procurement documents was not diminished by the circumstances that motivated it. The law, Collins said, could not create a category of acceptable fraud based on the nobility of its purpose, because the moment it did, the category would expand in ways no court could control. He said this without satisfaction. He said it the way a doctor delivers a diagnosis they wish were different, directly, because clarity is the only kindness available. Then he said the sentence. For years. With the possibility of early release at the 2-year mark, subject to good behavior and the discretion of the review board. Babatunde wrote something down. Adiz wrote something down. Femi did not move for a long moment, and then he nodded. A single, small nod, the kind that means I heard you rather than I agree, and Bimbala, in the last row, pressed her thumbnail into the pad of her index finger and held it there and breathed. For years. 2, possibly, with the review board. Tenny would be 8. Maybe 9. Old enough to understand a little more than she understood now, which was either a mercy or its own kind of cost, and Bimbala could not yet tell which. She did not stay for the formal close of the proceedings. She stood when everyone stood for Collins's exit, and then she walked out of the courtroom while the administrative details were still being handled, because there was nothing left in that room that required her presence, and she needed to be outside before the specific quality of air in there became something she associated permanently with this day. The corridor outside was long and fluorescent lit, with the scuffed linoleum floors of a building that processes too many people to maintain any pretense of dignity. A man in a security uniform was eating from a takeaway container near the stairwell. Two lawyers she didn't know were talking in low, rapid voices about something unrelated, their wigs slightly askew from being put on and taken off repeatedly. Bimbala walked past all of it to the main exit and through the glass doors and into the Lagos afternoon, which hit her like something physical: the heat, the noise, the smell of traffic and street food, and the particular aliveness of a city that continues regardless. She stood on the steps for a moment. Then she took out her phone and called Mrs. Folake to check on Tenny. Mrs. Folake said Tenny had eaten 3 cabin biscuits and was currently explaining to the television why a cartoon character had made a bad decision. Bimbala said she would be home in an hour. She put the phone back in her bag and walked to the bus stop. She visited Femi 4 days later. The prison waiting area had the specific atmosphere of a place that has given up on comfort without being willing to acknowledge it: rows of plastic chairs bolted to the floor, a single ceiling fan rotating too slowly to do anything useful, a water dispenser in the corner with an empty bottle and a handwritten note taped to it that said "out of order" in capital letters, as though emphasis might help. Bimbala sat in one of the plastic chairs with her bag on her lap and her hands folded on top of the bag and waited for 40 minutes while the woman beside her nursed a baby and the man across from her slept with his chin on his chest. She had dressed carefully, not in the sunflower dress. She had folded that and placed it at the back of the wardrobe, not permanently, just for now, but in a plain blue dress she had owned for years, the kind of dress that made no particular argument about anything. And she was wearing her wedding ring. She had taken it from the small zip pocket inside her purse where it had lived for 4 months. A simple gold band, nothing elaborate, the kind you buy when you are young and in love and not yet aware of how many things will eventually test the decision it represents. And she had put it on that morning while Tenny was still asleep, standing at the small mirror in the corridor, and she had looked at her own hand for a long time afterward. When they brought Femi in, he saw the ring before he saw her face. She watched his eyes drop to her hand and stay there for a moment, and something shifted in the set of his jaw. Not dramatically, just the small muscular adjustment of a person absorbing something that matters. He sat down across from her. The table between them was the width of the rules, close enough to talk, too wide for anything that required touch. "Tenny," he said first. "She's fine. She asked me to tell you the cartoon dog learned to swim. Apparently that's important." Something moved across his face that was close to a smile but didn't quite complete itself. "And you?" "I'm managing," she said. He looked at her hand again. "When did you?" "This morning." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I saw you. In the courtroom. I saw you the whole time." "I know." "Bim." He said her name the way he had always said it. 2 syllables, the second one slightly softer, and it was such a familiar sound after 4 months of absence that she had to look slightly to the left of his face for a moment. "You didn't have to." "I know," she said again. He looked at his hands on the table. "Did it? Did any of it?" "No," she said, and she said it without blame, without softness, just plainly, because plain was all she had energy for. It didn't change anything. The sentence is the sentence. He nodded. He had known this. She could tell from the way he nodded that he had already made his peace with it, or at least had started the long work of making his peace with it, the way you start clearing a flooded room, not because the flooding is over, but because you have to begin somewhere. "I'm sorry," he said. "For all of it. For the part you didn't know about and the part you had to carry after." Here is the thing about apologies that come from people who genuinely mean them: they don't fix anything. They were never meant to fix anything. A real apology is not a transaction. It's not "I say sorry in exchange for you stop being hurt." It's simply one person saying to another, "I see what happened. I see my part in it. I'm not going to pretend otherwise." That's all it is, and it's also everything, and Bimbala had spent enough time in the past 4 months being angry at Femi to know the difference between an apology that wanted something from her and one that didn't. This one didn't want anything. She said, 2 years, Babatunde thinks. Maybe less if the board. 2 years is a long time. It is, she agreed. Tenny will be. She'll be fine. She's fine now. Her heart is Bimbala stopped. She picked up again. The last checkup at Reddington was clean. The surgeon said everything is holding. Femi closed his eyes for a second. When he opened them, they were wet at the corners, and he blinked twice and looked at the table. Good, he said. That's good. They talked for the rest of the visiting hour about small things, Mrs. Folake and the cabin biscuits, the cartoon dog, the school fees situation, a distant cousin of Femi's who had called Bimbala twice and whom she had not called back. They talked the way people talk when the big things have been said, and what's left is the texture of a life that still has to be lived. When the guard announced 5 minutes, Bimbala straightened the strap of her bag on her shoulder and stood up. I'll come again next week, she said. You don't have to. I'll come again next week, she said. He looked at her hand one more time. The ring. Then he looked at her face. Okay, he said. She was standing outside the prison gates, waiting for the bus, when a black Toyota Camry pulled up slowly and stopped a few meters ahead of her. The window came down. Collins was in the passenger seat, not driving, which told her he had come specifically and had brought someone to drive him, which meant this was not an accident and had not been an accident at any point. He looked older outside the courtroom. Or perhaps he looked the same and she was simply seeing him without the robes for the first time since she understood who he was, and without the robes he was just a man in his 60s in a plain white agbada, which was not nothing, but was also not a gavel. He did not get out of the car. He looked at her through the open window and she looked back at him from the pavement, her bag over her shoulder, the plain blue dress, the ring on her finger that she was no longer hiding. I know who you are, he said. Not as an accusation. As a statement of fact, the way you establish ground before a conversation. I know, she said. You knew who I was. From the beginning. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. A Danfo bus rattled past on the road behind her, the conductor hanging off the door, shouting a destination. Collins waited for it to pass. The rice was good, he said. For what it's worth. She didn't know what to do with that, so she said nothing. He looked at her for another moment, the same measuring look, the courtroom stillness, and then he said, For months is a long time to carry something alone. He said it without pity, which was the only way she could have received it. Pity would have made her angry. This was different. This was the observation of a man who had spent 3 decades watching people carry things alone into courtrooms and had never, until recently, thought carefully about what the carrying cost them outside of one. You have a good daughter, he said. Bimbala looked at him. I know. He held her gaze for a moment longer, and in it was everything that the past 2 weeks had been. The rice, the dress, the cracked Samsung placed face down, the legal brief, the courtroom, the sentence, all of it, compressed into the kind of look that doesn't require language because language would only make it smaller. Then he nodded once, the way he had nodded at things in her stall when he had processed them and filed them away, and the window went up, and the Camry pulled back into traffic and was gone. Bimbala stood at the bus stop. The afternoon was doing what Lagos afternoons do, loud, indifferent, continuous. A woman nearby was selling bottled water from a cooler. A man on a motorcycle was arguing with someone on his phone. 2 children in school uniforms were sharing a meat pie on a low wall, tearing it carefully down the middle so the division was fair. She looked down at her hand. The ring caught the light the way it always had. Nothing spectacular, just a plain band doing what plain bands do, which is simply to be there. She had spent 4 months hiding it because she had been afraid of what it announced. A husband. A family with a missing piece. A story that would require explanation. She had folded herself small to keep the secret large, and the secret had still come apart, the way secrets do, not in a single dramatic moment but in small accumulations. A child's sentence, a dropped envelope, a pair of eyes that had been trained for 30 years to see what people were not saying. What she had not expected, in any version of how she had imagined this ending, was that she would be standing at a bus stop outside Kirikiri with nothing resolved and nothing rescued and nothing fixed, and feel, underneath all of it, something she could only describe as solid. Not happy. Not relieved. Solid. The specific groundedness of a person who is no longer managing 2 versions of their life simultaneously. The lies were gone. The dress was folded away. The secret had cost exactly what secrets always cost. More than you budgeted, paid in a currency you didn't know you were spending. She was alone at a bus stop. Her husband was inside a building behind her. Her daughter was at home with a retired schoolteacher and a tin of cabin biscuits. The ring was on her finger where it had always belonged. The bus came. She got on. She paid her fare and found a seat by the window and watched the city go past. The yellow buses, the roadside sellers, the buildings that leaned slightly toward each other like people sharing a secret of their own. And she thought about Tenny, whose heart had been repaired by money that should not have existed, and who was at home right now explaining to a television why a cartoon dog had made a bad decision. Some things you cannot fix. Some things you simply survive, and then you go home, and you make dinner, and you answer the questions your child asks with as much truth as they are old enough to hold, and you come back the next week, and the week after, and you carry it not because it is light but because it is yours. She did not iron the sunflower dress that evening. For the first time in 4 months, she simply left it in the wardrobe and went to bed. Silence isn't protection. It's just a slower way of bleeding. She didn't get a miracle. She didn't get a rescue. She got something quieter and harder than both. She got to stop pretending. And sometimes, that is the only freedom available to a person who has been holding everything together with nothing but willpower and a well-ironed dress. If this story stayed with you, it's because some part of you recognized it. The hiding. The managing. The love that doesn't know how to ask for help. Share this with someone who needs to hear that it's okay to put the dress down. And if you're new here, welcome. This is the kind of story we tell on this channel. Human. No shortcuts. Subscribe so you don't miss what comes next.